Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I am excited to be talking about my favorite books of 2020. And while I am more than ready to bid farewell to this godforsaken year, as I'm sure many of you are as well, books have been one of the few bright spots in these otherwise grim times. And I actually ended up having a significantly better reading year in 2020 than I did in 2019. And so putting together my favorites of the year list was actually quite difficult this year, which is always a good sign. But because of that, I am going to talk about a couple of honorable mentions before I dive into my top 10 books of the year. The first honorable mention I have is Golden Gates: Fighting for Housing in America by Conor Dougherty, which looks at the housing crisis in America by focusing in on its epicenter, the San Francisco Bay Area. This book blends compelling narrative journalism with hefty investigative reporting and policy analysis, which gives it this rare quality of being both meaty and substantial, but also incredibly readable and accessible and interesting. Conor Dougherty has such a masterful command of the policies and bureaucracy that have made California's housing crisis such a catastrophic quagmire. And then on top of that expertise, he gives you these real-life characters and stories to latch onto. And his writing has a clarity and a cleverness that just makes it an absolute delight to read. And I do hope that more people pick this book up, because what's happening with housing in California and the Bay Area is, I think, a harbinger of where the rest of the country is headed as well. My second honorable mention is Exciting Times by Naoise Dolan, which is an excellent debut novel that follows Ava, a young Irish woman living in Hong Kong, as she navigates that aimlessness of being in your early 20s, as well as two very different romantic entanglements, one with a posh British banker named Julian and one with a Hong Kong lawyer named Edith. The banter and observational humor in this book are so sharp and so smart, and Naoise Dolan's writing captures that earnestness and performative indifference and minor underlying agony of early adulthood perfectly. She's an author who acknowledges the frivolousness and self-involvement of her characters while also taking their feelings seriously. And Ava, the protagonist, is often exasperating, but is also self-aware and self-deprecating enough that she makes for an extremely endearing narrator. This is a book that I loved and have recommended to a lot of friends this year. And now getting into my top 10 books of the year, starting at number 10, I have Nothing Ever Dies: Vietnam and the Memory of War by Viet Thanh Nguyen. This is an academic look at the war in Vietnam and how the gears of industrial warfare and industrial memory, coupled with the forces of conquest and nationhood, work together to shape not only how we remember wars, but also our entire relationship with and orientation towards war. It's a fascinating look at the ethics and aesthetics and industries of war and memory, and it's a book that has already kind of fundamentally rewired the way that I think about and interact with the art and literature and films and culture that inevitably spring up in the wake of war in order to either grapple with it or commemorate it. Nguyen's writing is aerobic and illuminating, and the selection and depth of sources that he looks at here is just fantastic. This book is truly a treasure trove of insight and expertise. At number 9, I have The Odyssey by Homer, as translated by Emily Wilson. And this was one of my favorite reading experiences of 2020. I read it at the end of that kind of long, dark spring, and it was probably the first book of the year that I truly could not put down. And falling headfirst into this centuries-old story, especially at a time when the present moment felt so overwhelming and inescapable, was really kind of a magical thing. And in terms of the book itself, Emily Wilson translates Homer's epic in a way that frees it from the staid, laborious texts of translations past and gives it a lift and a buoyancy that seems to restore it to the kind of timeless story that it began as, something spoken and shared and passed down. She uses iambic pentameter throughout and also avoids using overly ornate or fussy language, which gives the verse this rhythm and flow that allows you to imagine someone telling you this story. And that choice on her part honestly completely changed my relationship with the Odyssey. At number 8, I have another classic, albeit a much more modern one, and that is A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry. This is a masterpiece of 20th century American literature and playwriting, one whose 1950s Southside Chicago setting is so vivid and transporting and specific to its place and time, while its text and language and ideas feel as vital and contemporary as anything. Particularly timeless is the way that Lorraine Hansberry captures each and every character's individual hopes and struggles, the way they chafe against the tight walls of their particular circumstances, and how each and every one of them has their eyes on the future, on a hoped-for horizon that they may or may not reach. Each character in this play feels like a tiny universe, and the way that Lorraine Hansberry renders the contrast between the claustrophobia of their physical lives and the utter expansiveness of their hopes and dreams and humanity is truly unforgettable. At number 7, I have Reading the Romance, Women, Patriarchy, and Popular Literature by Janice A. Radway. This is an academic look at the romance novel, its readers, and its place as a cultural product in the American consciousness and the American publishing industry. This was written in 1984, so it is quite dated, but it also offers this fascinating look at how the romance genre came to be, how it evolved over time, and how it has been viewed by publishers, editors, and readers over the decades. And because this is a fairly old book, it is kind of a historical document in its own right, in that it's just fascinating to consider how much the romance genre has changed and evolved in the last 35 years, both in terms of the actual content of the books and the targeted audience, and how romance as a genre has become so much more mainstream and accepted and even celebrated, particularly in the last several years. And so I highly recommend this for romance readers, but also for people who are interested in genre fiction, popular culture, the publishing industry, or just kind of cultural history in general. Then at number 6, I have Savage Conversations by Leanne Howe, which is a play that consists of a series of midnight conversations between Mary Todd Lincoln, the widow of President Abraham Lincoln and a patient at an Illinois sanitarium, and Savage Indian, the ghost or spirit or memory of one of the 38 Dakota men who were hanged on December 26, 1862 at the order of President Lincoln. This is such a haunting play, and one that reads almost like poetry, at least in the sense of how Leanne Howe employs language and rhythm and imagery in these conversations between Mary Todd Lincoln and Savage Indian. And there are monologues here, particularly from the character of Savage Indian, that will give you chills, as mournful and defiant as they are moving and beautifully wrought. Mary Todd Lincoln is also a fascinating and frustrating character to grapple with here, a personification of white violence and white culpability and white guilt, but also at the same time a disposable woman who is struggling mentally, and Leanne Howe plays with that complexity and duality beautifully. And this really is just a work that proves more and more rewarding the more you sit with it and consider everything that it's grappling with. Then at number 5, I have The X-Talk by Rachel Lynn Solomon. I read several romance novels this year, and The X-Talk was far and away the best of them. It's also the only romance novel that has lingered with me this year in the same way that Red, White, and Royal Blue lingered with me last year. Just one of those rare books that makes you feel warm and happy whenever you think of it. This novel follows Shay and Dominic, who work together at a Seattle public radio station and who are blackmailed into pretending to be exes in order to co-host a relationship advice show called The X-Talk. So this is not only an enemies to lovers romance, but it's also this clever and delightful inversion of the fake dating trope. And I just found the whole thing to be extremely fun and really, really sweet. It has a lot of great pop culture references, the banter between the two leads is pitch perfect, the third act conflict mostly made sense, which is a huge feat for a romance novel, and the leads had other things going on in their lives in a way that was really satisfying, but also in a way where the story didn't get too sidetracked from the central relationship. Highly recommend. Next up at number 4, I have Lot by Bryan Washington. This is Bryan Washington's debut short story collection, and what a breath of fresh air it was. Bryan Washington's prose is unlike anything I think I've encountered before. It's emotional and sentimental at its core, but restrained on the surface in all the right ways. His narrative voice is kind of casual and shrugging, but can also just wallop you with a single sentence or a tossed off gesture that betrays just how deeply his characters feel everything. And the way Bryan Washington can work within a circumscribed setting, the handful of Houston neighborhoods that make up these characters' worlds, and yet draw from that highly specific geography this entire canvas of human emotions and experiences, is remarkable and actually really reminds me of Alice Munro in some ways. Like Munro with her small Canadian towns, Washington seems to be one of those rare writers who can mine so much from one setting and from within the confines of the short story form. And I genuinely hope he continues to write short fiction for a long, long time, because he has such a talent for it, and this entire collection is just a force. At number 3, I have Sansei and Sensibility by Karente Yamashita, which is a collection of short stories and essays that all circle around Japanese American experience, and particularly the experiences of Sansei or third generation Japanese Americans. The first part of this collection consists of previously published essays and stories with publication dates ranging from 1975 to 2019. And the second half of the book is a series of short stories that spoof Jane Austen's collected works, reimagining those classic tales with Japanese American Sansei kids at their center. So this is an extremely varied and limber and often surprising collection. And while it doesn't necessarily always feel entirely cohesive piece to piece, collectively all of these tones and registers that Yamashita is working in gives you this really dynamic and almost kaleidoscopic sense of Japanese American history and experience and identity in all of its multitudes. And when you pull back from it, you can also see how the first half of the book really sets you up to understand and appreciate everything that Yamashita is doing with the Jane Austen spoofs in the second half. I'm just truly obsessed with Karente Yamashita's brain and how much this collection made me think and how much it made me feel in those moments when Yamashita deftly slips from snarky satire into these brief flashes of deeply felt sorrow and regret and grief. Just phenomenal. At number 2, and the best nonfiction book that I read this year, I have The Warmth of Other Suns, The Epic Story of America's Great Migration by Isabel Wilkerson. This is a truly magnificent work of narrative journalism and oral history that tells the story of America's Great Migration by tracing the lives of 3 individuals who all migrated from the Jim Crow South to cities in the North at various points in the 20th century. And what I think is so impressive about this book, beyond the hundreds of oral history interviews that Wilkerson conducted in order to write it, is the way that she structures and organizes decades upon decades worth of stories and information. She's able to follow the lives of these 3 central characters while masterfully grounding you in contextual history and flawlessly incorporating these vignettes and anecdotes from other migrants, along with articles and literature and art from the period, as well as later writings and studies about the Great Migration, and the collective effect of how Wilkerson incorporates all this information into one book is that you get this close, intimate look at what the migration experience must have been like on an individual level, while also being granted this wide historical perspective that allows you to see and understand the full scope and enormity of this movement that fundamentally changed the shape of America. It's an absolute must read, and I also highly recommend the audiobook because Robin Miles' narration is just perfection. And last, but certainly not least, the best book that I read in 2020 was White Ivy by Susie Yang. This book is a great Gatsby for the 21st century, with all of the twists and turns and what the moments and brutal class commentary of something like Parasite. It's so smart and so well written and so tightly plotted, a kind of perfect page turner while also being this incredibly rich and layered and thematically complex novel. And on top of all that, it also really feels like a vital new entry in the canon of American dream literature. It's just so good, and I truly cannot think of a better way to start your 2021 reading than by diving into White Ivy if you haven't already. Those are my absolute favorite books of 2020. I hope you all had a wonderful and rewarding reading year, and I hope the new year brings you books that will excite, challenge, comfort, and surprise you in the best possible ways. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.